Anunnaki of Nibiru, mankind's forgotten creators, enslavers, destroyers, saviors, and hidden architects of the New World Order. And he's also got the latest book, The Seventh Planet, Mercury Rising, just recently been released, and we're going to get into some of that today. This is a follow-up show, and if you want to check out the other shows, you can obviously go for the archives at capricornradio.com. Without further ado, let's bring on today's guest. Hi, Gerald. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, James. It's really great to be back here with my Irish brother. I'm really excited about the show and the commitment we've made to each other about how we're going to share this information.
Well, I'm glad we're doing this, Gerald, because we have quite a lot of different concepts. I mean, we got a lot of history there. We got a lot of Sumerian accounts to go through. We got a lot of philosophy there. We got some spirituality and consciousness to bring into all this. And I guess I wanted to pick it up from where we were last time, Gerald. And we're going to talk about the tools versus slaves theory. These biological entities that were created on this beautiful planet Earth for the workers, for the Anunnaki. And we're going to talk about why not create tools instead of slaves, and why the slave theory, or why the tools versus slaves. But inevitably, this is going to, when we get through some of this data today, we're going to probably bring it back to consciousness, because this is the most important. This is why we're talking today, Gerald. This is why we're trying to raise people's awareness of all this. So maybe we'll get into some of that. The big question of all, Gerald, is the Anunnaki. They come to planet Earth. They have this gold mining operation, like we discussed in the last episode, and of course they create these the workers. People. I actually had this conversation last week, Gerald, and this is kind of maybe just lead us straight into it today.
Go ahead.
People were, philosophizing with me, and they're like, well, why would you create a biological entity? Why would you go to that such level? And I was like, well, number one, because you could, and number two, because you're genetically advanced, and number three, it's better than tools. And they just couldn't understand. And this is coming from an engineer, Gerald, that it is a better operation than tools.
Yeah, well, I mentioned this in the book, and I think this was one of the neatest parts I wrote, was wrestling with the idea why an advanced race wouldn't come prepared to use the tools if that's the resource they were after. And I think part of it was a miscalculation on their part in thinking that they could get the gold from the oceans that probably required different mining tools than it did if you had to go dig ore out of the ground. So part of it was I don't think they came prepared to actually do the kind of mining they ended up having to do. But I went through a scenario with folks. Yeah, excuse me. And sure. Postulated a project that I had been working on when I was doing evolvable hardware. And that was, imagine, let's look at what goes on Mars right now. So imagine you build a rover and you give it all these sensors and effectors so that it can go pretend to be a human on another planet that, the oxygen level and such, the radiation level doesn't really support a biological being to be there. But if you could put a biological being there and not deal with the remote telemetry problems of sending a signal to the thing, possibly not getting it, maybe having a problem with the communications module, possibly having something happen to one of the electronics modules that is part of charging the batteries, and all of a sudden, you've got a robotic, unmanned autonomous vehicle that's got a limited life, and it's going to die. So there's all these windstorms, weather, obscuration of the lenses, effectors not working right, so it could pick up the little rock. Now think about what it's trying to do and replicate the behaviors of a human. If you could put a human in a suit and overcome the environmental constraints and put them in the same capacity, functioning as this unmanned autonomous rover, well, a meat entity that's in communications with the host that sent them there would be far more effective, especially if they didn't have communication problems and all those things. And if you're in full communication, you know what your mission is, get this, look at that, dig some of this up, put it, you can get it done much better than you can with a machine. So that said, there's other reasons to look at what the Anunnaki did relative to this issue. Okay.
Sure.
And actually, before I finish the Mars thing, I wanted to put one more piece in there. So now imagine that you had to train this Martian rover with a rule set to allow it to overcome its environment, all the unanticipated things that it's going to see, and try to capture that, a rule set, so that you could keep your information gathering telemetry robot alive. Well, it's near impossible to anticipate every possible environmental circumstance and permutations that can occur. And I gave one of those in the book, recognizing danger, for instance. Humans do this at an intuitive level, whereas a machine may see something and never make the inference that, hey, that's dangerous for me, unless it got captured in a rule set by one of the programmers that set it up. So because of that problem, it had me focused in my graduate research. How do you take all these disparate inputs that we use to create sensor fusion, an awareness of what's happening in your environment, to assess what out there is interesting and or dangerous or helpful? So when we went into the book, and we're going to get to there later, defining the term interesting. I kind of gave away a little clue, but not the generic term of the definition. So comparing and contrasting a machine operating as an unmanned autonomous vehicle performing telemetry and possibly data gathering on another planet is really instructive to compare what the Anunnaki had to face here on Earth. So now all of a sudden they originally show up around 450,000 years ago with about 50 workers in the Persian Gulf, migrate to Africa with Enki, and all of a sudden they don't have any major tools to do mining, and they're confronted with a big problem. These people, actually I went back and read the Atrahasis account. It was after only one Shar they got upset. So that's only 3,600 years. Okay.
Wow.
Anyway, so they revolted. Well, at that point they were faced with this meat versus tool decision. And you realize that they already came prepared with meat hosts that were their workers that were doing this for them. So they already had made a statement about their propensity to use biological entities versus machines. Now, did they have advanced mining tools that these biological entities got to use and didn't get to disclose to humanity? Very possibly. Okay? Mm-hmm. We've seen everything from rock vitrification to unbelievable underground spaces that have been built, and you have to ask yourself, well, did they not have anything but a copper chisel? That's hard to believe. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is when Enki and Anu and Enlil and I believe Belet Ili or Nin Herzog were at the council meeting to decide about these primitive slaves that they were about to create, mm-hmm. They certainly understood the trade-off between meat and machine. And let's look at some other kind of hard facts relative to meat. Number one, if they were designed so that they were communicated with bidirectionally through the electromagnetic spectrum, which they would have done, it explains a lot about the human antenna theory that I brought up in the Anunnaki and Naburi, how it is that our meat is sensitive to the electromagnetic spectrum in both receiving and sending signals to communicate with them. And this brought up the idea of, that never changed, and the fact that you're a meat modem communicating continuously, whether you're transmitting and they're receiving and communicating or not, you're always transmitting. So you're still a telemetry meat modem. And they're still using you. Okay, so let's go back to the mind. So mm-hmm. Now all of a sudden they're faced with, well, should we create meat or a machine? Well, it seemed like they chose biological entities, and there's another reason for that. Let's think about if you've got an advanced piece of machinery that's being used hard in mining for a very long time, it's going to require maintenance. It's going to require substitute parts. And unless you're coming here to set up an assembly line to be able to produce this and keep this operation in continuous functioning, that's a pretty big jump from where they started thinking they were going to get colloidal solution from the ocean to full on dealing with a South African mine. Major processing. Mining is a difficult task. Anyway, so at that point they're like, well, why have a factory to produce parts when you've got replicatable, easily reproduced biological entities that if you could have enough of them, they can meet your labor requirements. And they seem to operate that way. Mm-hmm. And also, they're, when you don't need a factory to support them, and they're self-replicating, and actually they're quite replaceable. Gerald, and that's hard to say, but the reality is it's true.
Gerald, I in my mechanical engineering days in university, we actually did robotics. It's not what I specialized in, but we had to do a robotics module. And we had to program a very basic robot to go and do something. And the amount of lexicon and programs and language that you have to tell that machine to go and do something, like pick up a pencil even. It's like there's so much programming and control and everything to get it right just to do a simple task. I mean, self-replicate.
Right. Well, essentially what you're stumbling onto is how do you teach the the intuitive awareness, the sensor-fused reality that a human is able to do to a machine, a computer. How do you teach it to look at the environment and go, that's interesting or that's not? I mean, if you look at all the objects in a simulator, even the game simulators, if you had to divide your attention among all of them simultaneously, it's impossible. Well, our world is the same way. And our body is the same way too, in that we seem to have this ability to focus based on a prioritization that's endemic in our biological design. And this goes back to some research I was doing. And a company I worked for that was named after this organ was reticular systems. So it was named after the reticular activating system, which is a primitive part of the pons in your brainstem that basically controls your awareness. And so, you ask yourself as you're going through the simulator out there going, well, why am I interested in that? And why am I not interested in that? Well, what drives your focus of attention to interest is part of this primitive construct of your reticular activating system. Okay, so I guess while we're talking about meat, did we finish on tools versus slaves? Do you think we put a nail in that one? Because I think we did.
I think we did.
Because clearly that's what they did. And so when it came time to replace the Ujiji rebels, who were meat servants, and they were very advanced ones too, not subservient beings that didn't understand what was going on. They were called fellow gods. So when they got replaced by another meat entity to do the same function, that's where we show up on the scene in all the genetic studies and the location in Southeast Africa with the gold mines, the stories from the Sumerians talking about that's what they did. It all fits. And, for a scientist like me and like you, when you read something like that and there's corroborative evidence that can't be hand waved away, it's hard to walk away from.
I think the big thing is, Gerald, this keeps coming back to genetics. This keeps coming back to biological engineering, highly sophisticated. And like I say, that explains not just the biological robots, these meat slaves that were here doing the mining, but it also explains this longevity of the Sumerian gods.
Mm-hmm. Right. Actually, one more thing I want to talk about.
It explains so many things, Gerald.
Right, it does. Before we jump off into talking more about splicing chromosomes and possibly this genetic mixing issue, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about, and that's, imagine that you truly were a biological being that they designed, such that you had bidirectional communications with them. They could send you something over the electromagnetic spectrum, not over a Motorola radio attached to your head, okay? I'm talking through the electromagnetic spectrum. Very advanced understanding of that, which was clear by Enki's taking the energy out of one being and putting the other. They knew a lot about the electromagnetic spectrum. And the idea of telepathy to them was probably second nature. So for them to be able to communicate with us over the electromagnetic spectrum into our receive part of the demodulator, right? I call this a biological modem, modulator, demodulator. That's what a radio transceiver is. Well, you're really a biological transceiver or a meat modem. That's a term I'm coining. Well, imagine that something happened and you got stranded on Mars. You were in a suit where you could survive, and they were communicating with you over the electromagnetic spectrum. You're getting your mission, you're digging up rocks, you're testing the water, all the things that they want you to do. Then all of a sudden, something happens and you lose communication with them. You can transmit, you're saying, hey, danger, danger, danger. I'm running out of oxygen here. I need you guys to beam me back on the ship or whatever. Well, at that point, imagine that you were transmitting, but they weren't listening anymore.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
That's the state that most people are now in, is they're actually a bidirectional meat modem, and they're not, unless they are able to overcome the consciousness suppression that's happened in this particular zodiacal age, and it's happened before. They never actually have their receivers set to the point where they can listen anymore. So in other words, their communication's cut off, and there are these meat modems running around in the simulator with no direction. And you can see that in the world. And everybody's searching for the meaning of their life because of this, because of what happened.
In a way, they've lost their curator, Gerald.
Exactly. And so, in one of the, I think it was, I want to say it was one of the Immortal movies. It was one of the comic book shows.
Mortal Kombat?
Well, I want to say it was Thor or one of those. But anyway, Loki was in it, okay? And he's in Germany with a bunch of people cowering around on the ground. And he shows up and says, you people are he gets them to all bow down, right? And he goes, you people were born into slavery. You need someone like me to tell you what to do. And I thought about this, this meat modem issue and your command being stuff. And, a lot of people are operating in that way because they're lost sheep, because they've lost this connection. So they don't understand the connection back to their source. And I think this was intentional.
Okay, so Gerald, here's a big one then, okay? Let's bring this into consciousness or compassion as well. I mean, if they created us for this purpose, were they compassionate towards us, or were they giving us a level of consciousness or awareness, or both? Just enough to get us to do the task and not enough to revolt, overthrow, be aware and go, I'm not going to work anymore. I mean, there must have been a threshold there, Gerald, where they said, don't give them too much.
I think you're hitting on something really deep. And that is, and we know from Enki's teachings and also from his son Ningshita's teachings, that we were endowed with a particular interface to the electromagnetic spectrum that allowed us to have the experience, the knowledge of good and evil, these levels of consciousness that they had. And this came up in the Garden of Eden when Enki told them, oh no, you won't die if you eat this plant. You'll just start waking up like we do, like we are. And this ties into the chakras and the Hindu levels of consciousness. So these quantized levels of consciousness are very interesting. If you ascribe to consciousness being energy quantized into various levels in your chakras. Imagine you start out the lowest one. You've got the consciousness of, whatever that chakra allows before you're allowed to proceed through the next one. Well, that consciousness is very interesting in that its scope precipitates what you focus on as your awareness. So you're going to be focused on things that you're aware, only things that you can be aware of are within the realm or the envelope of the consciousness level that you're at. So as that envelope or those quantized states of energy increase in your electrical interface that Enki designed into us. Okay, 7 chakras on the 7th planet. We can see 7 wavelengths in the visible spectrum from 400 to 700 nanometers, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Well, it turns out those are the same wavelengths that show up in your chakras. So this is by design. So ask the question again. Were we given an interface to have a communication back with the source? It looks like we were. And this was the original interface. Actually, it never changed. The question is, the issue was that people weren't aware that they had this spirit energy interface that's built into them so they can get out of this place where they're meandering, unmanned autonomous vehicles that are not being commanded anymore. And I know I'm making some weird analogies, but I hope people understand.
Well, ironically, I mean, look at how much people are programmed today in a hypnotic sense. When you're talking about being programmed by electromagnetic energy, I mean, look at people who look at logos. You want to talk about all the big advertising companies like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, exactly. All their icons, secret societies or whatever group or situation on this planet, everybody uses some sort of a symbol or symbolism, to program the mind, Gerald.
Well, remember also though, there's good and bad operating simultaneously. Okay, don't forget that. There were benevolent forces on the Enki side that used us as primitive workers. He wrestled with the idea of doing that over our fate and destiny and how it impacted our evolution, giving us a jump start versus enslaving us. And ultimately, I believe he felt like his intentions were pure. He was trying to help out the team accomplish a very difficult mission. And in retrospect, in some of his writings, and I do believe he felt like he did the wrong thing. And I think based on that, knowing that we are his creation, not to leave out who he venerated was the creator of all. And I want to make sure people hear that. The Anunnaki may have been geneticists, but they weren't ultimately the creators of the seeds of life. They clearly told us that the creator of the seeds of life, of all life, came from the creator of all. And later when we get into chapter 5, you're going to see what those design rules were that they actually disclosed to us. Mm-hmm. And this has been the secret knowledge inside the secret societies for a very long time. And so the idea that we're going to be exposing that to the lay public of all the secret mysteries that go through all time, this is not some fad. This is the ultimate knowledge that came directly from our progenitors. So I was very excited to look at that as a scientist, connect all the way back to the Sumerian King's List, back into the Anunnaki, and be able to explain that. And we're going to get there, and I know. So we're going to probably talk a little bit more about how once we went from meat slaves to this particular issue where the second person of the geneticist showed up.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, I may have mentioned it or may not, but for us farm folks that know about these kind of things, if you take a male horse and a female jack and you breed them, you'll end up with a mule, and it's impotent. Well, lots of animals that interbreed across their class or their category end up with offspring that can't procreate. I give you the liger, for instance, the lion and the tiger.
Yeah.
They breed it, produces this massive offspring, but it's impotent. Well, the same thing, I believe, happened with Enki and the being that he chose to mix his genetic material with in the steppes of Africa, where they clearly were watching all the bipedal hominids that were down in that same area where they're doing the mining. You know, they had to be aware of all of them. Everything from Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, the Denisovian findings that 400,000 years ago that kind of overlaps when the Anunnaki were here. So there were several bipedal hominids out there that he was aware of. So the idea of mixing his DNA with one of them, hoping to produce an offspring that could fill their labor requirements in the mines, you know, it was kind of urgent. They've had a revolt. They waited too long. They waited till it became important and urgent. They didn't listen to Stephen Covey and deal with it was important but not urgent yet. Okay, they should have acted sooner.
Sure.
But when they did that, they also all of a sudden ran into this problem where all of a sudden, you know, maybe it was by design that they knew it couldn't procreate. But that's when the analysis of the DNA took place by Enki's son. Now, at this point, I believe Enki was the carrier of the caduceus. I want to clear that up. This is the two serpents around a central pole with the wings and a knob on the top. Yeah. And it's used in the American Medical Association and in Britain as well, representative of health.
So iconic.
That was Enki's symbol, which was commented on by Enlil in the Garden of Eden, where he called him the evil snake. Well, yeah, there were snakes going around the pole, but they represented the double helix of your DNA. Well, something important relative to that symbol, and I've been all about that symbol for a long time, was it got handed off to his son, Ningshita, who was the geneticist that shows up in this account. So he's the one that got to deal with the DNA that wasn't producing an offspring and went off into the lab and figured it out. Right? So I view him as the second geneticist, creator in the creation account. Yeah, there was a creator of all, created the seeds of life. Then there was Enki that came along and modified the seeds of life to create a sentient worker that could do their commands. But then Ningshita came along and made it so that they could procreate.
He's the hero of the tale, Gerald, Ningshita.
Well, you know, he doesn't get a lot of notoriety because he was the brilliant one behind the doors that did all the work. And how often do you see that in the world? People, you know, sycophantically taking someone else's work and claiming it's their own to get paid. It's disgusting. Well, this guy was full of honor and integrity, and you'll see it all through the book. Anyway, so he comes up with a splicing capability that he implemented on the second chromosome, which you can see in our genetic code today. So they had a mismatch between the number of chromosomes that are required to procreate. You know, the X and the Y had to be just right in a male and female. Well, he had to line these up, so he did. And this is evident in our DNA. So I wanted to bring that up for people who don't know about that. But Ningshita was his name. He showed up as a really funny name in the Enuma Elish, which was the Babylonian epic of creation that was read every spring in Babylon by Marduk after he changed the name of Nibiru to his own name in it. Okay, there was a previous version to that. Anyway, so Ningshita was his name, but back on the Enuma Elish, his name was Mumu. It was really funny, and I mentioned this in my book under my synchronicities. One of my kids chose his email address to be Mumu way back when he was, first getting his first email account. And I thought that was hilarious until I read the Enuma Elish and realized that Ningshita's name was Mumu, and it was referring to the planet Mercury. So his affiliation later with the Romans as Mercury was quite interesting. Of course, he was Hermes in Greek, but he became Mercury again in Rome. Mm-hmm. And then this goes back into the deep knowledge about alchemy and the first alchemist. And this all comes out in my book later. But this being, I chose him specifically because of what he did. He looked like he was benevolent to mankind, just like his father was. And the fact that he ended up getting the caduceus given to him was symbolic of a power transfer. It always was in the Sumerian documents. You know, sometimes like the son would take over the kingship from the father. Well, not only would he get all the instruments, the crown and the tiara representing kingship, blah, 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 but he also got to absorb all the names and attributes of all the beings that were on the council below him. really an interesting thing. So with Marduk, he did this, and he was kind of such a self-promoter that he made this really obvious. So when they were reading the Enuma Elish every spring in Babylon under Marduk rule, and he was at the height of his rule, circa 2000 BCE. Okay. But they would read all 50 names, because he took over the Lord of the Command Council away from Enlil. He smote Enlil somehow through his brutal warring with him, and ended up in this Lord of the Air, Lord of the Earth command seat of 50. Well, he'd have the 50 names of Marduk read with the Enuma Elish. So representative of this namesake subsumption is what I call it. They would subsume all the powers of the ones that were below them, all the way up to where the rank was. So I thought that was really, really, so at the same time, thinking about that, maybe there was something to it, that they got endowed with the powers of the ones when they held this rank. So the fact that Ningshita, who became Thoth in Egypt, who became Hermes to the Greeks and Mercury to the Romans, was also the one who showed up going back and forth to Nibiru, brokering the liaison between the Adapa. And I think that shows up in the 3rd chapter. We're probably going to talk about that. So he's a very, very important being who kind of gets left out of the story somewhat. Well, so I saw this happening, being an inventor, having many patents to my name. Mm-hmm. And constantly in engineering, like you mentioned in the last show, it's a creative process, and you're constantly taking gray matter and turning it into real circuit boards and things like that. Well, you could see that this being was like that. So I guess as a scientist, I really identified with his perspective and decided to adopt it and tell this story in the 7th planet, Mercury rising, all the way through.
Sure.
So now you realize where the title came from. Part of it was from the synchronicity I mentioned in chapter 12, where the idea of Mercury rising came from. And then the first part of the title came from a clear idea about which planet this was in their cosmogony, and making that available and aware to people, kind of like what Sitchin did by naming their planet the 12th planet. Well, we know a lot more about the 7th planet than we knew about the 12th planet. So
sure.
That's how that came to be.
With respect to Ningshita, and like I say, I think he's the hero of the tale. He's
Totally.
brought in to solve this procreation problem. Okay. Do you think then, and let's explain that as well. In genetics, but he comes in to save the day, to get these biological robots, these mules, offsprings, these to reproduce and make sure that they keep reproducing. So he solves this problem. But do you think perhaps then that he put in this hidden essential knowledge? Was that his route into giving us
Well, I really think so. I really think so. We talked about that the last show, about these latent circuits. Listen, you know that if Enki was having issues about enslaving these beings versus allowing them to have a jump start, an evolutionary jump start, so that means they still got to achieve the consciousness that the Anunnaki achieved through this time process, and he knew that. So my question is, knowing that, did he communicate with his son, and they craft a time sequenced set of circuits in your DNA such that over a period of time you became just like they were? I believe that's absolutely what they did, and we talked about those 8 circuits last time on the show. So I do believe that the master programmer, Ningshita himself, actually did that to our DNA.
Let's talk chromosomes, Gerald, on the spliced second chromosome. Don't we have this weird thing on our chromosome chart?
We do, and I didn't go dig into the stuff where I had researched this, but I wrote about it at some point. There's clear evidence that our second chromosome has had some splicing, so that the number of chromosomes from the zygote, probably from this Neanderthal DNA that was used, or Cro-Magnon, whichever it was. There were lots of bipedal hominids. They probably did it to multiple, and it was not just one. And, in order to line up the genetic material, the X and the Y chromosomes. So, there's clear evidence. And one of the researchers out of Hawaii, I'm trying to remember his name right now, who was a geneticist, discusses this as well. But it's pretty damning knowledge to know that this was done. So, and it's not a secret.
Does anybody does geneticists today even have any answer for that chromosome problem, that fusing?
Well, I just remembered his name. I think and I've reached out to him a couple times. I haven't heard back from him. I think his name was William Brown out of the University of Hawaii. He was onto this story, and I think he ended up getting some darkness poured on his path because he was trying to expose it. But I think he's the one that or somebody like him who's in that space. I think it'd be wonderful. I'm not a geneticist. I'm an electrical engineer, so I can possibly, hypothetically tell you what I know about it. And I've read Signature in the Cell and several books on genetics because of my kid's condition that I mentioned, right? I was focused on genetics trying to help my kid. So
Sure.
when I ran into this stuff, it kind of bolstered me at least to hopefully not speak beyond my knowledge level, but but I'm not a medically trained geneticist. I don't decode the human DNA, even though that whole genome project ended up at UCSD. Quite interesting.
Where do you think the awareness of the original people, going back to ancient Sumeria, the workers, call them the workers, do you think they were just like totally inept and like, on the low level awareness scale, and then...
No, actually I don't.
Do you think the starting point
you remember when Enki and Enlil were in the Garden of Eden and they're having this discussion about these labor forces going to procreate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when they got thrown out of the garden because they made the choice to choose consciousness over enslavement with Enlil, he got really upset. And, there's the whole story of mankind falling into sin and being thrown out of the garden. Well, the reality was Enki intercepted the Adapa, the atom. He didn't go to some, exile or something. He actually became the chief priest in the city of Eridu. He was Enki's chief priest. He taught him everything he knew, actually. He was very, very wise. So the idea that they had the capacity to take on the mental capabilities and the constructs that the Anunnaki designed with ought to be very telling for you. The idea that intelligence keeps increasing over time with every civilization is just not the case. There's rise and falls of civilizations where whole knowledge bases get erased, where you get put back into your primitive worker state, right? Well, he was also called out, the Adapa, as the one who even knew some of the rules, the language, the key words to affect even the weather. He apparently was saying something on his fishing voyage where he interrupted the weather with this powerful knowledge he had from Enki. So much so that he got the attention of Anu and got himself hauled back to Nibiru with Dumuzi and Nagshita to explain what happened. Very, very interesting tale. So the idea that they were primitive workers, yes, at the Garden of Eden, but at that point you realize that Enki had endowed them with the capabilities to have the intelligence, which he said, but only, the downside was only having a lifespan of 120 years. Now,
Gerald, let's pause for a moment. Think today of what we would do. Imagine we were doing this today. Forget about the Sumerian tales for a moment. Let's say we started playing with the genetics and creating people, or whether they were for enslaved or not. I mean, the morality around that and the questions and the task that you would undertake and whether it was right or wrong. And the philosophy around the whole idea of what you would do. I mean, this is basically what's happening in ancient Sumeria. I mean, Enki and Enlil, are they okay with it? Are they not okay with it? Are they feeling, sentiment about what they're actually trying to do? Are they wrestling with it? It's all there. It's all there, Gerald.
That brings us right into the modern issue with those kind of discussions.
Yeah.
Should we have created Dolly the sheep? Should we be cloning animals? Should we be doing genetic modifications on plants to allow more humans to assimilate and eat this stuff?
Stem cells.
All these kind of issues about right or wrong are being put right in your face, so that you as co-creators could probably make the same kind of decisions they had to wrestle with.
It's amazing that people today are oblivious that this has already happened on our planet in Sumerian tales. These guys are already wrestling with these moralities issues.
Well, now that it's happening now on the planet, I think it makes it so that it's much more believable. Because imagine 200 years ago reading this stuff. Wow, what a bunch of storytelling. Because you didn't have the consciousness. You weren't at the consciousness level, so that your awareness could find that interesting. Remember what I talked about, these sequences of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get to the highest consciousness level, your awareness is going to be focused on the thing that's most interesting, and it always is. There's one after the other things that are interesting. And it's same with the body. I want to talk about this. The reticular activating system is very telling in how it works in the body. And I used to do this with people. I'd walk up, and you can do it either verbally or do it somatically and touch them. I'd say, okay, well, you're aware of all these different thoughts and things going on in your head, but are you aware of the sensation of the wristwatch on your left wrist right now? What is it? Or you, better yet, if you're close by, you just touch them in a spot where they didn't anticipate it. Well, all of a sudden you realize how the reticular activating system works. It all of a sudden makes all that external environment unimportant, and it draws your awareness to that single point of contact because that's the thing that's interesting right then and there. And that's how the categorization of awareness works. It does it based on a prioritization process. You can't be focused on everything simultaneously. You only can be focused on the things that are most important in your environment. And this comes out as I was building this 6 Degree of Freedom simulator later that we will talk about, in how you teach a machine to focus on the environment, create sensor fusion and awareness, and the AI, it's an AI construct, okay? How to do this with machines. Well, back to this, not to get off track too much, but that's what I was trying to do, was create an automated way to not do a rule set a priori for an unmanned autonomous vehicle that could learn from its environment and do the same thing that we do. And I think this has now gotten to the place where it's much more mature. As a matter of fact, the other day I was watching this special on drone technology where this guy was on stage and he had 3 or 4 drones flying around him, and they were working as a team. The drones were communicating with each other, and they also had proximity warning devices on them so that if you got too close to them, they would back away, and eat them from each other. So they started showing how these things could be given survival rules like a human, and it was kind of crazy to see this. So.
The thing is, even this whole thing that we're discussing here, this genetics, the morality, the implications of it all, I think whether you're talking Enki, Enlil, Ninharsag, Ningshida, whoever on this Sumerian gods list, I mean, I think when you look at all their tales, I think there's inherently there's intelligence in there, superior intelligence. I think there's good and bad. I think there's emotions. I think there's probably some psychopathic actions as well, Gerald. But I think inherently, just let me finish. I think inherently, I think there's good is going to win the day, and I think that they're going to, I think their way around all this was to put this gateway to escape the enslavement. I think they said, okay, look, it might not be morally good what we're doing. Okay, we might have no choice. We're going to have our Nibiru, wiped out with solar radiation or whatever's going to happen on that planet. We need this gold, and we're not going to survive anyway. Okay, they might have had some morality issue with it, but I think their only way out of it, at least maybe that's how it was sold to them, was that let's just put a gateway in for them to escape this enslavement, and that'll just appease ourselves. I think somebody
I think that was for their future de-guiltification.
Yeah.
They knew they enslaved them. They gave them that as their little reward so that, over time, when they were ready, they would wake up to the knowledge that they had.
Yeah.
Well, at the same time, they had implemented a veil so that, they could control what level of consciousness you were at to determine, if you weren't even aware that you were enslaved, you wouldn't have any propensity to want to revolt. And remember, that was the key feature that had to be in this replacement species, us, because the Gigi revolted and they didn't want that to happen again. Why would you design a replacement that had the same propensity as the one before you? Yeah. So I think it's very clever what they did with these latent circuits of awakening. And it's clear to me that they're tied to galactic wobble cycles and external energy triggers, as well as the symbolic ones that we discussed in the circuits that I find so interesting from Dr. Leary. I think it was just brilliant work. As a matter of fact, I don't even know how it got buried for so long.
I did a show actually on Timothy O'Leary, the Harvard years, before the whole LSD culture stuff. Some of his earliest work was incredibly pioneering.
Listen, I have to say, I'm kind of bad with names. Was his last name Leary or O'Leary?
No, Leary. Yeah, the original.
Leary, okay.
No,
I've been lambasted. I don't know how many times for pronouncing Edward Case with one E at the end, not saying KC, like somebody can't understand it's the same person. But okay, there you go. It's KC, one of my heroes. Okay.
For sure. Yeah, well, Timothy Leary without the O. Originally it was O'Leary. And the problem is when people leave Ireland, they used to drop the O's and they get misspellings of their names. But Timothy Leary, some of his work, and I mean, certainly around these, what we talked about on the last show with Timothy Leary's research. I mean, I think this is incredibly obvious once you hear his analysis. I mean, it makes so much sense of all these receptors and.
Yeah. Well, what tied it together for me was Ian Lungold and Dr. Callum's discussion of the Mayan calendar and how those were tied to these 9 rows of the evolution of consciousness that were tied to frequency. And I started to go into that on my blog, on my website, to describe what they understood. Now, and the reason the Mayans were so important to me, because Ningshita was Quetzalcoatl. Okay, for all you listening out there, the Mayan calendar came from the genius Ningshita, who gave mankind the calendar and language according to Thoth in Egypt. Okay, well, it happened in Sumeria as well, but Ningshita was the one behind the solar lunar calendar that the Mayans ended up with this advanced knowledge. So understanding his knowledge about when he set up the start date for the Mayan long count to the point where you pass through the galactic dark rift that they used. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a galactic wobble they were basing it on. So I think that's brilliant. And now you realize it's the same person who was a programmer and a scientist and a geneticist. Well, clearly he probably made a deal with his dad that said, yeah, we've got the veil on them right now, but when a couple of these cycles happen, their quantized consciousness will go from here to here to here based on these latent circuits, and they'll be awake at the same level we are. It's like a slow, iterative unfolding of what happened to you so that they can manage, the information flow back to you to let you know, yeah, we did this to you, but don't be too mad at us because look what we gave you. We gave you connection to these same light spirits that we have that allow us to be immortal beings. So when you find out that you're from that source genetically, that you have the same capabilities to live eternally they do, that's in you, and you're already an eternal spirit that's living in a meat host, it changes a lot of stuff about religion and your understanding of the world. And actually it gives you a lot of hope that you realize now there's a direct connection for all people to this energy through your latent circuits that are now, and if you look around the world, what's happening with people, and I've been watching this for years. There's a lot of people whose latent circuits are now being triggered and they're waking up.
People have
and it makes sense if you look at the Mayan calendar, the last stage on it in that telescoping cycle. And by the way, I've got to mention Ian Lungold's name. I just found out with you recently that he had passed away in 2005.
I never knew, Gerald.
He was a brilliant, brilliant researcher. And I think he along with, and I don't want to leave out Dr. Kalaman. Johann Kalaman, who wrote I think it was the Mayan Cosmogenesis, but in there he describes these 9 underworld frequencies that fall into your brainwave region that has never left me because I realized that was very important in this worlds within world view that we're going to end up talking about later. So Ningshita, it was at the center of that, okay? So don't lose track of that.
So this is the secret weapon that Ningshita had. He's like, okay.
Well, yeah. Exactly.
This is just for the listeners, Gerald. Let me explain it. So we're going through these galactic cycles and we're going through these precessional wobbles, and he knew this and he said, okay, I could put something in there so that when we do go through that, we're going to get this little DNA activation. And nobody's going to know about that. So I think Ningshita had this secret little plan, to put this.
This is a backdoor program.
Yeah, it's a backdoor program that Ningshita. This all makes sense there, Gerald. This makes so much sense to me.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Okay, so Ningshita steps in. He's given the solution to procreation. He's the hero of the day to the Anunnaki hierarchy and everything else. So he's got himself.
He wasn't originally, but yeah.
Well, yeah, he was originally, but Ningshita comes in, solves the procreation problem. He's given a bit more credibility, given a bit more leeway, given a bit more control, perhaps.
Given the Caduceus? He was given the Caduceus.
Exactly. So in doing so
there was a power transfer there.
So in this power transfer he then decides to slip in this, DNA activation, this upgrade going through the dark rift and what the Mayan talked about. So then we go from procreation to us having a little gateway of consciousness. He does it on the sly. Nobody knows about it. And then when they find out about it, when the hierarchy of the Anunnaki find out about it, they go crazy, Gerald, and they just try to wipe us out.
Do you think Enki and his son being around Enlil, knowing that he destroys everywhere he goes, that they knew that they were going to have to put something within them to give them a fighting chance to be on the same level, to become aware of who the destroyer is, the great deceiver, so that they could break out of that darkness that was poured on them as a veil, so they were entrapped. Think about the term enlightenment, overcoming this veil of entrapment in this simulator that we're in. So I totally think, as if Ningshita was as sophisticated as I think he was, the idea of having simulation model, the planet Key, and all the other planets in the orbit retrograde, who had what resource through their spectroscopy studies. Think high science. We're novice at science compared to a race that was doing space travel and was taking the energy out of one being and putting it into another, like a reverse exorcism. This is crazy science that they're aware of.
Mm. It's fascinating. You know, the thing is, when you look at this, like I keep going back to this again, when you look at this story with advanced genetics in mind, it answers everything. It doesn't answer one or two problems.
And from a scientific perspective.
I'm sorry, and from a scientific perspective.
Cheetah was a scientist, and so was Enki. So you have to understand science to really make sense of what they were doing.
Usually I find, Gerald, okay, when you use one thing to try and solve a problem and it solves the whole problem, well then that's probably the right thing. It's probably true. And that's what
well, that's Occam's razor. You know, the simplest answer is usually the right one.
When you can find one simple answer that explains everything, well then it's not fanciful, it's not mythology. There you go. No. How you press it, you either accept it or you don't.
Well, I think that's why the field of genetics has been such a guarded area, is that, you know, the truth is in our DNA. And ultimately, you remember Zecharia Sitchin in one of his interviews I was watching, and I mentioned this on a radio program. His dying wish was that somebody, a geneticist, would take apart the DNA of one of these Sumerian bodies that they found and prove his theory was true once and for all while he was still alive. And, you know, we have the capability to do that right now. We found Gilgamesh's grave, okay? We have disclosures from the University of Pennsylvania that they've got some old Sumerian bodies in their archives they didn't even know they had that they can get DNA from. So that, you know, the truth is inches away from it being disclosed. And the reality is, just from what we've been able to dig into, it's almost irrefutable. The Sumerians knew this, and they didn't have a problem with it. They knew they were created by the Anunnaki to serve them, and they did it willingly.
You know, Gerald, I'm glad you mentioned Gilgamesh's body there. I actually discussed that a long time ago. Do you think the American military went in? This is right wing now, this one. Do you think the American military went in to get the body of Gilgamesh specifically? Well,
I think there was a lot of storytelling about what the motivations were to go into the cradle of civilization in southern Iraq. Now remember how the country got divided, almost north and south, from Basra south of the first incursion in 1991. By the way, I have to disclose something.
Sure.
When I left the military in 1989, I turned down receiving an Apache helicopter and becoming an instructor pilot, and then going off to Germany, one of the places I really loved, because I'd been over there twice under the Reforger mission, where we took our whole battalion and went to Germany to simulate, you know, people coming through the Fulda Gap in tanks and overrunning Europe, like in World War II. So I had some exposure there, and it was all very interesting to me because of the context in which I got exposed. You with me?
Yeah, I'm with you, man.
I probably shouldn't go off.
No, you're fine.
Too much. We got a lot of material to cover here, so.
Sure. Well, the thing is, the reason I say that is because I think if there was people out there with this knowledge, and I know it's the level that we're talking about, Gerald, and they could find Gilgamesh's body, and they had a location for it. I mean, there's evidence to say that they pulled out after they found the body of Gilgamesh. There's a BBC article talking about this, that the war ended as soon as they had the body of Gilgamesh. They brought
it was in 2003 that they actually got the body, and using Gilgamesh's writings about the orientation of his city, and after the German, and this is where the Germans started coming. They came, you know, Saddam Hussein brought the magnetometer team in to map out the city of Uruk, Gilgamesh's city, to find his grave, and they found it. And a press release was given in 2003 that they found it.
But apparently,
then it was exactly where the Tigris and Euphrates met, where he described, you know, so.
And apparently there was also a special technology developed. I think that there's a certain ferrous compound in the body. It's a very, very weak ferrous compound, long chemical formula, and it shows up in biological matter. And
that's interesting.
And they brought this special. It had only been developed the year before, Gerald. I think it's got ferrous, some sort of FeSO4. I can't remember. It's some long chemical formula. And when you put this special magnetometer over it, this special one that picks up only this biological ferrous compound, they're able to they can tell you if there's a body on the ground or not.
Sure.
You know.
Sure. I bet you the technology has gotten to the place now where you can practically do it from a satellite.
I mean, we know that Gilgamesh was like a demigod. This guy was half.
Well, yeah. Well, let's talk about that real quick. And so answering this issue for Zecharia Sitchin, who was seeking to find some genetic proof of this. You know, we know that Gilgamesh would be a good example because his mother was a full-blown Anunnaki goddess, and she was described as being Ninsun. and a very important being, okay? And that means that if his mother was a female, that means the mitochondrial DNA from her got contributed to his DNA. So it's very important. Mm. Okay, and that's probably why he was a king, because he was in the lineage of his father and his half-sister that got him there. Well, turns out his father was Lugalbanda.
If you wanted to grab some Anunnaki DNA, Gerald, that was the best chance, the best.
Yeah, well, I've mentioned that one a couple of times. Hey, you found his grave, blah, blah, blah. It looks like we can go get the DNA out of the bones of a Denisovian that's 400,000 years old. How about one that's 2,900 years old, right there in the grave of Gilgamesh? And so his father, not being an Anunnaki, but he was a primitive worker like us. Well, that was a very telling case in checking that his DNA was 2/3, Anunnaki, and you could see it's a perfect example of having both of our DNA, our primitive DNA that was done to us by Enki and Ningshita as a subset of theirs, mixed with, one of these high-ranking Anunnakis who had the pure blood. And this turns out to be a big issue, in that how pure your DNA is relative to the maternal source of the Anunnaki, the sacred feminine, and the extent to which you age. So if you had pure bloodline, it looks like you had the capabilities in your DNA to overcome the shortening of the telomeres, or if they had to have an elixir, on this planet, which looks like they did, which was monoatomic gold, to supplant that. Mm-hmm. But in general, I think by design, these beings had telomeres that didn't decay, and they could live very, very long times in a single body. And with their knowledge of the electromagnetic spectrum, if something happened to that body, they could easily replace it with another one and transfer their consciousness into it. So the idea of an avatar comes up even early in the first tablet of the Atrahasis, where Enki creates the first avatar, who was the Adapa. So we're all avatars when you come to realize that.
Yeah. I remember going through that whole 2012 thing and even before that, and the build up towards it, and people were going on about this DNA activation and all. I used to think there, and naively, I just go, oh, it's all a very new agey, whatever, and I wouldn't give it any consideration. But when you give me what we're talking about now, Gerald, and you give me written accounts and Sumerian history, it just makes sense to me. If it was told...
Well, now combine that with the Mayan calendar, the Zolkin calendar in particular, which was their slow unfolding of the evolution of consciousness.
The Mayan,
you will see that we went from galactic consciousness in the 8th level to universal consciousness in the 9th. That means probably that the energy level that's interacting with your human antenna, your meat modem, is at its highest state, and that's the time, at the highest level of consciousness, that the Anunnaki, in my opinion, would probably then finally disclose to their primitive workers that, yeah, we created you, and you've gone through this long process of awakening through these cycles, and now you're here, and you're one of us and we're one of you, and that's what it is. The reality is, I believe that is the case.
There are
we have become the Anunnaki through our DNA, and that's how we were programmed.
There are few people on this planet that would argue, Gerald, that we went through an energy, enlightenment, an awareness, an awakening, going through that dark rift. There's very few people. I mean, regardless of what level you were at on that awareness scale, everybody will say that there's an awakening on this planet to at least some level. Hopefully it's going to keep going, and hopefully it's going to evolve a bit quicker, and we get some good positive results out of it. Because I'm all into this.
Well, that's the real question: is the 100 monkey theorem going to be enough to overcome the beatdown that the New World Order is doing to try and take over the whole planet, put people back into a primitive worker consciousness, and have them be their slaves again, right? Well, there's forces here that don't want that to happen, and we get into that in the book later.
Sure.
And there is a war between light and dark going on, and it is representational of the high-level council members that were introduced to us in the last book, the Anunnaki Baru, which I put in the God table.
It's a complex.
And those are very, very real beings, this myth. And when you look at the symbols and systems that are in place to make their will happen, you'll realize light and dark are coming head to head again, and they're representative of these two clans, the Enkyites and the Enlilites, not to be too Hatfield and McCoyish, because some of them cross the boundaries between the family lines, some intermarried, but just as a simple a construct to talk about them. In general, there was a set of them, like you said, that were benevolent toward mankind, but there was a set of them that had the attributes of, a genocidal murderer that had no problem, like a serial killer, just wiping people out. No consciousness, no empathy. And we see that on this planet now with the barbaristic acts of some beings. It's man's inhumanity to man seems to know no limits if it's under the guises of this energy that's controlling the human antenna when it's unconscious or down at its root chakra level. It's barbaristic.
I spoke to Steve Bassett from the Disclosure Network, a Paradigm Research Group last week there, and he was telling me that I agree to a certain level. He was saying that look at the human spectrum on the planet as we are right now. You have at one end of the scale, psychopathic serial killers, brutal, vicious monsters that would just, do stuff for pure fun. And then you have at the other end of the scale, these savant type, intellectual, creative people. We have everything in between. We have this...
Yeah, serial killers to saints. Yep.
Serial killers to saints. Yeah, everything in between. And, and he was saying that, if these extraterrestrial phenomenon is coming to this planet, that they're going to want to talk to the intellectuals at one end and not the others. And I'm well, that kind of depends. I don't know. If we have identified the extraterrestrial phenomenon and what he was speaking of. I think, where we are on this evolutionary scale, I still think we're back in terms of where the Anunnaki original beginnings were. We had psychopaths.
I agree with you. Listen, they had personality traits that range from serial killer to saint, and we wonder where we got that. Well, they were free will beings to choose their own destiny just like we are. They were on their evolutionary path too, back to the light. And the reality was, not all of them were evolving at the same rate. So, you had some that were, I don't know, almost operating like they were in a penal colony. The idea of bringing 50 workers for you, that whether they were doing it willingly or they were ordered to because they were being sent on exile to here for some bad thing they did on their planet. We don't know that for sure. But look what happened in Australia. I mean, the whole island was set up by a penal colony that was the bad seed that was exported out of the UK. They didn't want them there. They sent them down to Australia and look, so that idea is not foreign.
Well, I did a show, Gerald, very early on in Capricorn Radio's earliest days with Shannon Doherty, and wonderful author. There's not very many authors that talk about the Dogon, but the Dogon's origins talk about these semi-aquatic reptilian fish gods called the Nummo. And apparently the Nummo were aware of the Anunnaki. Now, this is from her accounts, and this is on hearsay from her book, or her accounts or her research. But I think that the Nummo were aware of the Anunnaki, and that the Anunnaki would have wiped out the Nummo if they could have. But the Nummo were so far advanced than the Anunnaki. They just didn't. They just tolerated them. They weren't. They were empathetic, and they weren't. They weren't psychopathic or, genocidal, and they just said, just because you want to kill us doesn't mean we want to kill you. You haven't got that in your power anyway. So, it's funny. And they said that they were actually, here as a penal colony, they were on the run, basically.
I'll tell you a little story about the Dogon when I was digging into it. I found very, very, very interesting. First of all, I was back kind of on a mission working with some people in Arkansas. We were doing some structural integration work with a group of people back there, and I won't name any names or anything. But anyway, one of their people that was part of this church that was back there was a missionary in Mali. And he had lots of pictures that he shared. He had recently been over there and visited this, he was a healer that was there, and he was working with their tribe to help them. And, there was a lot of stuff going on. There started to be an incursion from from Islam that was overtaking the area. So they were starting to end up in some real heated problems. And now you look what's going on in Mali now. Ebola's there, and Boko Haram is there. It's like, oh my gosh. So anyway, there was something that came out of that, though. I'd been researching the Mali and reading about their understanding about how they came to their knowledge of Sirius B, the star Sirius B, which they clearly affiliated with. And, a lot of modern researchers go, well, we knew about Sirius A, you could see that, but how did they know about Sirius B? And also, how did they know about the spiral pattern that the two binary stars made around each other? And it turns out they had some wand. It looked like a staff with a strange angular head on it that when you oriented it in a certain orientation and rotated it, it mapped exactly the binary star pattern of Sirius A and B. So where did they get that? So there's some really interesting things about the Dogon. And they clearly had an ancient alien encounter at some point in their cargo cult.
Sure.
And they're still perpetuating that, hiding certain things in caves that represent these beings that they had encounters with.
They also have...
it's guarded 24/7 by one of their elders. It's amazing.
Yeah. Sirius C as well, Gerald. It wasn't just Sirius B. Sirius B and A is the main ones, but they were able to say about Sirius C because it's actually another one as well, and it's a triple star system.
Wow, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah,
one.
most people
Sirius
only...
B was as far as I got, and I was like, wow,
Yeah, well, that's because that one it says it all anyway. The other one's just a little bit for posterity, but Sirius A and B.
The idea that you bring up is that there could have been multiple alien species on this planet, visiting this planet, causing all kinds of different cargo cults, and according to, like I said, from somebody who was in the know, Paul Hellyer, who was exposed to this stuff, he said there were definitely 4 species and up to 20 of them on the planet.
Well,
They've been here for thousands of years, so we shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Gerald, we're going to take a quick break there. I'll be back in just a moment. But before we do, please give us out your website where people can find you, what you do, check your blog for updates and social media.
Okay. You can reach, the best way to get me is to go to my website, and that's GeraldClark77.com, GeraldClark 77.com. And from there, I've got links to my other media outlets, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or whatever. But I am starting to do more of my focused, interactions with deep seekers on my blog. So, I'm probably going to be moderating a little bit more and not tolerating so much ankle biting and stuff, because that's the area where I want people that are really on the inside. Not that I'm asking them to drink the Kool-Aid, but that's where I'm going to be spending more of my time disclosing some of the more engineering-oriented stuff, models and drawings and connections and things like that. So, and a lot of that may not be appropriate for higher-level communication, so I'm kind of restricting that a little bit, just so you know. So, GeraldClark77.com.
The Anunnaki of Nibiru, mankind's forgotten creators, enslavers, destroyers, saviors, and hidden architects of the New World Order. And he's also got the latest book, The Seventh Planet, Mercury Rising, just recently been released, and we're going to get into some of that today. This is a follow-up show, and if you want to check out the other shows, you can obviously go for the archives at capricornradio.com. Without further ado, let's bring on today's guest. Hi, Gerald. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, James. It's really great to be back here with my Irish brother. I'm really excited about the show and the commitment we've made to each other about how we're going to share this information.
Well, I'm glad we're doing this, Gerald, because we have quite a lot of different concepts. I mean, we got a lot of history there. We got a lot of Sumerian accounts to go through. We got a lot of philosophy there. We got some spirituality and consciousness to bring into all this. And I guess I wanted to pick it up from where we were last time, Gerald, and we're going to talk about, the tools versus slaves theory, these biological entities that were created on this beautiful planet Earth for the workers, for the Anunnaki. And we're going to talk about, why not create tools instead of slaves, and why the slave theory, or why the tools versus slaves. But inevitably, this is going to, when we get through some of this data today, we're going to probably bring it back to consciousness, because this is the most important. This is why we're talking today, Gerald. This is why we're trying to raise people's awareness of all this. So maybe we'll get into some of that. The big question of all, Gerald, is the Anunnaki. They come to planet Earth. They have this gold mining operation, like we discussed in the last episode, and of course they create these the workers. And, people, I actually had this conversation last week, Gerald, and this is kind of maybe just lead us straight into it today.
With meat hosts that were their workers that were doing this for them. So they already had made a statement about their propensity to use biological entities versus machines. Now, did they have advanced mining tools that these biological entities got to use and didn't get to disclose to humanity? Very possibly. Okay. Mm-hmm. Everything from we've seen everything from rock vitrification to unbelievable underground spaces that have been built. And you have to ask yourself, well, did they not have anything but a copper chisel? That's hard to believe. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is when Enki and Anu and Enlil and I believe Belit Ili or Nin Hartzog were at the council meeting to decide about these primitive slaves that they were about to create, they certainly understood the trade-off between meat and machine. And let's look at some other kind of hard facts relative to meat. Number one, if they were designed so that they were communicated with bidirectionally through the electromagnetic spectrum, which they would have done, it explains a lot about the human antenna theory that I brought up in the Anunnaki and the Buri, how it is that our meat is sensitive to the electromagnetic spectrum in both receiving and sending signals to communicate with them. And this brought up the idea of, that never changed, and the fact that you're a meat modem communicating continuously, whether you're transmitting and they're receiving and communicating or not, you're always transmitting. So you're still a telemetry meat modem, and they're still using you. Okay, so let's go back to the mind. So now all of a sudden they're faced with, well, should we create meat or a machine? Well, it seemed like they chose biological entities, and there's another reason for that. Let's think about if you've got an advanced piece of machinery that's being used hard in mining for a very long time, it's going to require maintenance. It's going to require substitute parts. And unless you're coming here to set up an assembly line to be able to produce this and keep this operation in continuous functioning, that's a pretty big jump from where they started thinking they were going to get colloidal solution from the ocean to full on dealing with a South African mine. Major processing. Mining is a difficult task. Anyway, so at that point they're like, well, why have a factory to produce parts when you've got replicatable, easily reproduced biological entities that if you could have enough of them, they can meet your labor requirements. And they seem to operate that way. And also they're, you don't need a factory to support them, and they're self-replicating, and actually they're quite replaceable. Gerald, and that's hard to say, but the reality is it's true.
Gerald, I in my mechanical engineering days in university, we actually did robotics. It's not what I specialized in, but we had to do a robotics module, and we had to program a very basic robot to go and do something, and the amount of lexicon and programs and language that you have to tell that machine to go and do something like pick up a pencil even. It's like there's so much programming and control and everything to get it right just to do a simple task. I mean, self-replicate.
Right. Well, essentially what you're stumbling onto is how do you teach the intuitive awareness, the sensor-fused reality that a human is able to do to a machine, a computer. How do you teach it to look at the environment and go, that's interesting or that's not? I mean, if you look at all the objects in a simulator, even the game simulators, if you had to divide your attention among all of them simultaneously, it's impossible. Well, our world is the same way. And our body is the same way too, in that we seem to have this ability to focus based on a prioritization that's endemic in our biological design. And this goes back to some research I was doing. And a company I worked for that was named after this organ was Reticular Systems. So it was named after the reticular activating system, which is a primitive part of the pons in your brainstem that basically controls your awareness. And so, you ask yourself as you're going through the simulator out there going, well, why am I interested in that? And why am I not interested in that? Well, what drives your focus of attention to interest is part of this primitive construct of your reticular activating system. Okay, so I guess while we're talking about meat, did we finish on tools versus slaves? Do you think we put a nail in that one? Because I think we did.
I think we.
Go ahead.
People were, philosophizing with me, and they're like, well, why would you create a biological entity? Why would you go to that such level? And I was like, well, number one, because you could, and number two, because you're genetically advanced, and number three, it's better than tools. And they just couldn't understand. And this is coming from an engineer, Gerald, that it is a better operation than tools.
Yeah, well, I mentioned this in the book, and I think this was one of the neatest parts I wrote, was wrestling with the idea why an advanced race wouldn't come prepared to, use the tools if that's the resource they were after. And I think part of it was a miscalculation on their part in thinking that they could get the gold from the oceans that probably required different mining tools than it did if you had to go dig ore out of the ground. So part of it was I don't think they came prepared to actually do the kind of mining they ended up having to do. But I went through a scenario with folks. Yeah, excuse me. And
Sure.
postulated a project that I had been working on when I was doing evolvable hardware. And that was, imagine, let's look at what goes on Mars right now. So imagine you build a rover and you give it all these sensors and effectors so that it can go pretend to be a human on another planet that, the oxygen level and such, the radiation level doesn't really support a biological being to be there. But if you could put a biological being there and not deal with the remote telemetry problems of sending a signal to the thing, possibly not getting it, maybe having a problem with the communications module, possibly having something happen to one of the electronics modules that is part of charging the batteries, and all of a sudden, you've got a robotic, unmanned autonomous vehicle that's got a limited life, and it's going to die. So there's all these windstorms, weather, obscuration of the lenses, effectors not working right so it could pick up the little rock. Now think about what it's trying to do and replicate the behaviors of a human. If you could put a human in a suit and overcome the environmental constraints and put them in the same capacity, functioning as this unmanned autonomous rover, well, a meat entity that's in communications with the host that sent them there would be far more effective, especially if they didn't have communication problems and all those things. And if you're in full communication, you know what your mission is, get this, look at that, dig some of this up, put it, you can get it done much better than you can with a machine. So that said, there's other reasons to look at what the Anunnaki did relative to this issue. Okay.
Sure.
And actually, before I finish the Mars thing, I wanted to put one more piece in there. So now imagine that you had to train this Martian rover with a rule set to allow it to overcome its environment, all the unanticipated things that it's going to see, and try to capture that, a rule set, so that you could keep your information gathering telemetry robot alive. Well, it's near impossible to anticipate every possible environmental circumstance and permutations that can occur. And I gave one of those in the book, recognizing danger, for instance. Humans do this at an intuitive level, whereas a machine may see something and never make the inference that, hey, that's dangerous for me, unless it got captured in a rule set by one of the programmers that set it up. So because of that problem, it had me focused in my graduate research. How do you take all these disparate inputs that we use to create sensor fusion, an awareness of what's happening in your environment, to assess what out there is interesting and or dangerous or helpful? So and we went into the book, and we're going to get to there later, in defining the term interesting. I kind of gave away a little clue, but not the generic term of the definition. So comparing and contrasting a machine operating as an unmanned autonomous vehicle performing telemetry and possibly data gathering on another planet is really instructive to compare what the Anunnaki had to face here on Earth. So now all of a sudden they originally show up around 450,000 years ago with about 50 workers in the Persian Gulf, migrate to Africa with Enki, then all of a sudden they don't have any major tools to do mining, and they're confronted with a big problem. These people, actually I went back and read the Atrahasis account. It was after only one Shar they got upset. So that's only 3,600 years. Okay.
Wow.
Anyway, so they revolted. Well, at that point they were faced with this meat versus tool decision. And you realize that they already came prepared with